now inside of 20 minutes and 30 seconds until liftoff. We're now seeing the big vent from the strong back.
Stage 2 RP1 load complete.
And we're now also hearing commentary, some periodic updates from SpaceX Launch Control that the second stage RP1 load is complete. So the second stage of the Falcon 9 is now full of rocket-grade kerosene fuel. And this vent that you're seeing from the strongback out at pad 40, the strongback is the mast, by the way, the structure just to the right of the Falcon 9 rocket. The vent that you're seeing now is marking the start of chill down of the liquid oxygen loading line that leads up the strongback from the ground storage tank for liquid oxygen into the second stage. And this is thermal conditioning of that line in preparation for the flow of liquid oxygen to begin loading the second stage of the Falcon 9 oxidizer tank at T-minus 16 minutes. So right now, propellants continue loading onto stage 1, kerosene and liquid oxygen. And on stage 2, the kerosene tank is fully loaded, and the liquid oxygen tank is now now preparing to be loaded with this chill down that you're seeing out there at pad 40, which is the visual sign that this thermal conditioning has begun. We're now seeing the end of that vent of oxygen vapor from the strongback at pad 40, and we expect in a few moments to hear confirmation that liquid oxygen loading is underway on the second stage.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
And there's the call from SpaceX Launch Control right on time that the stage 2 liquid oxygen load is underway. Again, SpaceX is counting down to liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket, 54 more Starlink satellites heading to orbit this morning from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. The photo you're seeing here is a file photo from a previous Starlink mission, but it shows what the stack of Starlink satellites looks like inside the payload shroud of the Falcon 9. These 54 satellites are packed one top of the other, held down onto an adapter, and then that adapter is attached to the stage 2 structure of the Falcon 9 rocket. 4 retention rods keep the Starlink satellites firmly attached to the rocket during their stay on the launch pad as well as the climb into orbit. And then once the Falcon 9 reaches the proper orbit, those retention rods jettison, allowing the 50 satellites to fly free of the rocket. And that SpaceX will be able to declare mission success, at least from the Falcon 9's perspective, that it put these satellites where they intended to go on this mission. Again, there are 54 Starlink satellites on board. These satellites each weigh between 250 and 300 kilograms. They're outfitted with inter-satellite laser links to allow the satellites to actually pass data between one another. This is kind of a streamlines the network and allows the network to function without the need of so many ground stations to transmit data to and from. These satellites will deploy their solar panels after reaching orbit. After deploying from the Falcon 9 rocket, they'll extend these solar arrays, and then they'll activate their ion propulsion systems and begin climbing from their drop-off orbit, which is at an altitude of roughly 100 to 200 miles, to an operating altitude of 335 miles. These satellites are heading into what's known as shell number 4 of the Starlink constellation. So the Starlink architecture has 5 shells at different altitudes and different inclinations. Some are at mid-inclination orbits, like today's mission is heading to. Some are in polar orbits that are generally accessible with launches out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. And all of these satellites are virtually identical and are built in an assembly line in a rapid production fashion at SpaceX's Starlink facility in Redmond, Washington. There are this mission today, launching 54 satellites. Satellites will actually surpass the 3,500 satellite point in the Starlink deployment. There are currently about 3,100 satellites that are currently active in the Starlink network. A few hundred have actually been deorbited or decommissioned or ran into issues and were never put into service. So about 3,100 are active. The total number of Starlinks launched after today's mission will surpass 3,500. This photo shows what a Starlink user terminal looks like. I mentioned earlier that the Starlink service is now available in more than 40 countries and territories. It's used, for example, in rural households, schools, homes, businesses. It's also used on the front lines of the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian military forces are now relying more and more on the Starlink service to maintain communications lines, as conventional terrestrial cell phone networks and internet networks are put out of commission by Russia's military. And SpaceX has donated thousands of Starlink user terminals to Ukraine for use by not only by civilians, but also largely by Ukrainian military forces to keep up their communications links and fight the Russian military during the invasion of Ukraine. The newest Starlink market is currently Japan. That was announced just last week by SpaceX. That's the first country in Asia to use the Starlink network, to open up a new market there. Now 12 minutes and 18 seconds until the launch opportunity today at 10:50 a.m. Eastern Time. Now 11 minutes and 33 seconds and counting. Here's a look at the countdown timeline. We've already passed a few of these milestones in this morning's countdown. We have minutes that the propellant loading operation had begun. And then at T-minus 16 minutes, we heard that the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket was being loaded with liquid oxygen propellant. Looking ahead for the final 10 minutes of the countdown, at T-minus 7 minutes, the Falcon 9 will begin chilling down its Merlin first stage engines. That involves flowing a little bit of super cold liquid oxygen through the engine compartment to thermally condition that hardware for ignition. At T-minus 5 minutes and 30 seconds or so, we expect to hear confirmation that the first stage has been fully loaded with kerosene fuel. Again, the second stage was fully loaded earlier in the countdown. At 4.5 minutes, we expect to see the strong back structure just to the right of the Falcon 9 to begin retracting away from the vehicle. It'll recline to about 1.5 degrees away from the vertical Falcon 9 rocket. And then at T with propellant, the liquid oxygen loading will begin terminating at about that point. And at that point, about 1 million pounds of propellants, kerosene, and liquid oxygen will be loaded into the vehicle. The fill and drain valves will be closed and secured for flight. And then the Falcon 9's onboard will take command of the countdown at T-minus 60 seconds. It'll oversee the final steps to configure the launch vehicle for flight. That includes pressurizing the propellant tanks on the Falcon 9 rocket. At T-minus 45 seconds, the SpaceX launch director will voice their final go for launch. And then at T-minus 3 seconds, the engine controller on Falcon 9 rocket will send the engine ignition command to light the 9 Merlin 1D engines on the bottom of the first stage. That's done using an igniter fluid called TTAB. It's aluminum triethyl borane. If this was a night launch, you might be able to see the green flash ignition from that igniter fluid. And then after a final health check of the engine performance, the onboard computer with the command to open hold down clamps. These 4 clamps that are holding the rocket on the pad will open to allow the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical climb to space. T-minus 9 minutes and 9 seconds and counting. Again, we're about 2 minutes from the engine chill down. That's the next major milestone countdown. T-minus 8 minutes, 18 seconds. After liftoff, the Falcon 9 will head northeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This map shows the approximate ground track that we'll see the Falcon 9 take after lifting off from Pad 40. We've labeled Space Launch Complex 40, that is Slick 40 here on this map. And we've also labeled the position of the drone ship a shortfall of gravitas, holding position about 400 miles or 650 kilometers downrange. That is roughly due east of Charleston, South Carolina, as you can see in this map. This is a very familiar trajectory for those of you who have watched Falcon 9 launches with Starlink satellites. This is heading to, again, shell number 4 of the Starlink network, flying northeast along this red line, parallel to the United States East Coast, and then off the coast of the Canadian Maritime Province. And the Falcon 9 will deploy the 54 satellites into orbit over the North Atlantic Ocean, about halfway between Newfoundland and Ireland, at about 15.5 minutes into the flight. Landing of the first stage on the drone ship, by the way, is scheduled for about 8.5 minutes after launch.
Engine chill has started.
We just heard the call at T-minus 7 minutes that the engine chill has started. This is the process that I mentioned moments ago to thermally condition these 9 Merlin 1D power plants on the bottom of the first stage. So a little bit of liquid oxygen will begin flowing into the engine hardware to thermally condition those components for ignition, because that liquid oxygen is chilled several hundred degrees below zero. They want to make sure that all those engine components, the turbines, the plumbing, are all conditioned and brought down close to that, so they don't suffer any damage and aren't suffer any thermal shock during the ignition sequence. This booster flying today is booster 1062. It's flying for the 10th time today. Here's a look at its flight history. It debuted back on November the 5th of 2020 with the launch of a GPS satellite for the U.S. military. It launched another GPS mission about 6 months later. And then it's also launched 2 crew missions, commercial crew missions, the Inspiration 4 private space flight with 4 passengers on board, and the Axiom 1 mission to the ISS with 4 commercial astronauts as well. And it's also launched 4 Starlink missions to date. This will be its 5th Starlink mission again. Booster 1062 is the booster flying today, going for its 10th flight to base.
tanks pressing for strong back retract.
In the last few moments, we've heard a couple of calls from SpaceX Launch Control that the first stage is now full of kerosene fuel, so about 46,000 gallons of rocket-grade kerosene has been loaded into the vehicle. Liquid oxygen continues flowing into the rocket at this point. That will be terminated at about T minus 2 minutes. And the next step we expect to see is retraction of the strongback.
Strongback retract has started.
Inside of 3.5 minutes until liftoff, the strongback, as you can see, has retracted to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9 rocket. It will retract further at liftoff. The next calls we expect to hear will be the termination of good oxygen loading.
Stage 1 lock load complete.
There's stage 1 lock slow complete, so the first stage liquid oxygen tank is now full. Second stage liquid oxygen loading will continue for a few more minutes, or another minute or so.
So with that, we have fully loaded our rocket propelled fuel and our liquid oxygen on the first stage. We'll hear a similar call out for liquid oxygen loading complete on the second stage. And you can see some humidity forming around the first and second stage. That's totally normal as we're topping off the tanks. The cryogenic liquid oxygen we load is very old, and it's causing clouds to form around the vehicle from the moist Florida air.
Stage 2 lock load complete.
1 million pounds of full and liquid oxygen on both the first and the second stage. And the booster you've got on your screen is flying for its 10th time today.
Ground closeouts have started.
With that call out, we're going to be venting some propellants from the transporter erector. As I mentioned, this booster is flying for its 10th time, having previously flown GPS-3 Space Vehicle 4 and 5 missions, Inspiration 4, Axiom 1, Nalsat 301, and 4 previous Starlink missions. We are planning to recover this booster on our drone ship named A Shortfall of Gravitas, which is currently stationed in the Atlantic Ocean,
Falcon 9 is in startup.
following liftoff and stage separation.
You go for launch. 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. And liftoff. 9. Go Starlink. Go Falcon. Vehicle 15 downrange. Nominal power and telemetry. The vehicle is supersonic.
So that Falcon is traveling faster than the speed of sound.
XQ.
And we've just passed through the point of maximum dynamic pressure that we'll feel during the flight.
And back tail has begun.
So that call out, we're about a minute away from main engine cutoff, a stage section, and then second engine start shortly after by fairing deploy. Those events will happen back to back. The call out of MVAC chill starting up, that means we've begun chilling those turbo pumps in preparation for second engine start.
Nico. Stage separation confirmed. And vac ignition. Fairing separation confirmed.
So with that, those 4 events complete, we will be attempting to recover both these fairing halves, again to use on a future mission. If you're just joining us, we had an on-time liftoff from Space Complex 40, 10:50 a.m. Eastern Time. On your screen, the right-hand side is our second stage, 4 satellites to orbit, and on the left-hand side is our first stage.
Acquisition of signal, Bermuda.
First stage making its way back to our drone ship stationed off the coast of Florida. Now, earlier that today marks SpaceX's 186th mission overall launch. As I previously mentioned, it's the 10th flight for this first stage. It previously flew Vehicle 4 and Inspiration 4. Axiom 1 now set at 301 for Starlink missions. Forge's next major milestone will be its entry burn, where we will ignite 3 of the Merlin 1D engines.
Mid-flight guidance, goals are following nominal trajectories.
And the second stage still has a few minutes to go here, with second engine number 1 just after 8 minutes into the flight. We are flying 54 Starlink satellites into orbit today. Starlink is a satellite internet constellation designed and manufactured by SpaceX to provide high-speed and low-latency internet for living in remote and rural locations around the globe. Next major milestone coming in about 20 seconds. That'll be the entry burn on our stage.
Stage 1 entry burn startup. Stage 1 FTS is saved.
So with that, first stage has ignited 3 of its Merlin 1D engines to slow down for atmospheric reentry. This burn pretty quick, about 20 seconds long.
Stage 1 entry burn shut down.
Both stages are following nominal trajectories.
Stage 2 FTS is saved.
One here will be the landing burn start for the first stage. The sequence there will be landing burn start.
Stage 1 transonic.
So with that call out, the first stage is traveling near the speed of sound as it's transitioning through the Earth's atmosphere. Its landing burn to start in about 20 seconds, followed shortly after by landing leg deploy, and around that same time we'll hear a call out for second engine cutoff on the second stage.
Stage 1 landing burn.
So the first stage has lit 1 engine to prepare for landing on our drone ship, named Shortfall of Gravitas on the right-hand side of your screen.
Landing leg deploy. Stage 1 landing confirmed. And back shutdown. Acquisition of signal to Finland.
So a few things called out there. First, Falcon 9 has landed. That marks the 40th landing of this year, 101st overall landing of a Falcon 9 first stage. Now, you also heard after that there was a successful second engine cutoff and a nominal orbit instant. With the completion of today's launch, it marks SpaceX's 40th successful Falcon 9 mission of 2022. And as you can see now, our second stage is carrying 54 Starlink satellites into low Earth orbit Now, if you're interested in following along with the deployment of those satellites,
Expected loss of
we
signal.
will continue
Jason,
to have our net on YouTube, our social media accounts for confirmation of deploy. Thanks a bunch for joining us today, and we hope you have